Tasmania is the full stop at the bottom of the world, and we live on an island of stories. For years now, the Tamar Valley Writers Festival has celebrated our great thinkers, writers and readers, and now we're excited to share these insights globally. I'm Lyndon Rigol, and throughout this series, my colleague Annie Warburton and I will be talking to writers, playwrights, comedians, poets, editors, and all of those who share a love of the written word, right here on the Tamar Valley Writers Festival podcast.
Nick Brodie describes himself as a professional history nerd. He started life as a boy from country New South Wales who spent a lot of time outdoors dreaming of dinosaurs. But he ended up the writer of a growing catalogue of popular histories about Australia. Before he settled down to writing Australian history, Nick got his doctorate in late medieval vagrancy of all things, before changing direction and taking up the study of archaeology. He's worked hands-on in that field, and he currently works as an archivist for the Catholic archdiocese in Hobart. Nick says he's always been a storyteller. He says he wants his writing to be both accessible and erudite, and to bring fresh angles to old tales. Let's find out how he does that. Hello, Nick.
G'day, Annie.
Thank you very much for coming in. Let's start with that New South Wales country boy dreaming of dinosaurs. What were your dinosaur dreams?
Well, largely informed by Jurassic Park. So, as a young teen, that's when that came out. But I was always a dinosaur kid. Where I grew up in country New South Wales, it's not fossil country. So, the reason I was always dreaming about dinosaurs is, in a way, I was always dreaming about looking for them, but never could. Across the road from my place, where I grew up, so we grew up on the edge of town, backing onto paddock, and my grandfather had a paddock. So, sort of that real country boy at the edge of town thing. Across the road from me was an empty block, and that was mudstone. So I used to love going over there and just sitting there and looking out at the horizon and imagining what it must have been like, because it was at the edge of an ancient lake. So that sense of deep time and ancient change and so on has always really captured my imagination. So
did you want to be a hunter of dinosaur fossils?
Certainly, I'd love to be a paleontologist still, you know. give me a chance and I'll go do it. But it's really that sense of the world, my place in it, I suppose, is really what the dinosaur thing comes from. It's not just dinosaurs, even though, like most young kids, you know, fixated on T-Rex and Triceratops. You know. I've always been interested in the broader history of everything around me.
Well, you gave archaeology a go, didn't you? I know that was after you started getting into history. But why did you get into history first?
Well, I really got into them both at the same time. So as I went to Canberra to university, I did history and archaeology majors all the way through, and ended up doing honours in history. So there's a certain point where I decided history's more my thing than archaeology, because I was forced to make a choice. In part, that's because my archaeological and historical interests at that time were principally European, and the opportunities for archaeological fieldwork in Europe was sort of beyond my means at that time.
So how does this fit in with your eventual adoption of a career, or studying first and then writing history?
I was negotiating for PhD opportunities at that point. That's sort of my gap year in Canberra before I came down to Tasmania to take up a PhD. And at that time, I was really following through my honours study, and so I was still engaging with history and thinking about it in those terms.
What was your honours study?
My honours thesis was on the 16th century hospitals of medieval York.
Is this anything to do with the medieval vagrancy that became the subject of your doctorate?
Sort of. So the medieval hospitals aren't medical hospitals in the modern sense. They're what we would now call almshouses or care homes, and they cover a really broad range of institutions which evolved during the course of the medieval period, and they basically go through a period of transformation at that time. As many of them get dissolved with the monasteries as part of the Reformation, others get reformed into more streamlined almshouses. Yes, it certainly fits with that whole social welfare.
It seems, as an early historical subject, it seems very remote from Australia and from your background. How did you get interested in that subject?
A general interest in medieval European history really blossomed for me in my undergraduate studies. I had the great fortune to be taught by John Tillotson, a great professor at ANU, over a number of years, and I did every course of his that I could. So I really gathered the tools of being a good historian from him and his teaching, and that was all applied to medieval Europe and that sort of world. So that's really how I got trained to be a historian, and so the content and the training obviously went together. And then I just found a little niche that interested me and sort of followed it.
Because I've read that you're a great reader of James A. Michener novels, and I have to say, I too conceived a great interest in certain areas of history through reading about them, through these very lively, popular histories. So what did you get from Michener?
A sense of big history, basically. I think that's one of the crucial things that the Michener novels taught me as a child. Because Mum was the one who got me on the Michener novels. She gave me The Source, was the first one.
And that's about? That's
the one about Israel and Jerusalem, and so it's that mix of multi-ethnic, multi-religious world over a long period of time at the centre of much of the way the West at least conceives of itself. So it was a really interesting piece, and you can see those threads of long-term history and culture and identity start to mix. And I think that's what I took forward from those novels, that sense that history doesn't have to be small. History can be big and broad and beautiful, and in that largeness you can see big pictures emerge over a long period of time.
I think with Hawaii, as I remember, the first chapter is actually about how the volcanoes came out of the ocean and formed the land itself. I mean, talk about deep history.
Yeah, well, Centennial, Michener's North American one, he starts with the dinosaurs, and I still remember that. And I particularly remember at that time thinking that I loved this, but also the dinosaurs are wrong, because by that point it was grossly out of date and the science was wrong.
Look, I read something, a quote from you, or about you, which says, yes, Nick Brodie, this is, I think, some workshop you've done, discusses making methodological history accessible to a broad public audience, especially by using people to revise master narratives rather than situating people in master narratives. Now, that's all a lot of academic jargon there, but what does he mean? What does it say about the way you research and write history?
I'm a bit of a revisionist, I suppose, as it comes across in a lot of my work. But I think of myself very much as a methodologist. That's how I often describe myself. The history I do is not bound to a particular period or place. That's what most career historians will do. They will become experts in an area that is geographically defined or chronologically defined, or both. I'm really interested in how history is done, how you work it out. How do we know what happened? What are the nuts and bolts behind the scenes? And so while a lot of my published work doesn't really have that to the front, I like to have it there sort of sitting just behind the surface in such a way that readers who wish to can see that at work. The most obvious example is Kin, where I'll describe driving and visiting gravestones, but also working my way through newspapers.
Yes, this is the one which is look at the coming of the Europeans to Australia through your own family's history. Well, tell us something about that then. Tell us more about the methodology of it.
Yeah, well, so because family history is a weird one to do, because you work backwards, right? So you start from yourself and then you have to work back into the deep past. But I had to transform that into a narrative that comes from, that follows a traditional narrative chronological format. Otherwise it would have been very difficult for readers to follow the way I actually jumped around. So the narrative as it exists in Kin doesn't fully reflect my experience of researching it. But what I really wanted to do with that is to give a sense of how the research is done. So in the very early phases, it's not just telling the story of the convicts and how they came afoul of the law and ended up here, but which documents enable me to know what happened, to deal with the complexities of the document making process, the vagaries of document survival, and the way that stories even can emerge over time, especially with the newspapers. So at that time, Trove, the online repository of Australian digitised newspapers, was really starting to take off. And I was really interested in looking at new ways of doing history with those electronic resources. It's one thing to simply go out and grab as much as you can because you've got it all at your fingertips. It's another thing to work out how a story might change over time, or how different narrative traditions can emerge from the same historical event.
So did you have convict ancestry?
Oh yeah, I've got plenty of convict ancestry. The earliest one in kin arrives in 1796. He arrives as he's actually a young lad. He's about 14, convicted for treason in Ireland, and because he's so young, he's not hung. He's sent here instead, and it's part of that whole Irish Troubles phenomenon. There are other ones who have more mundane petty theft sort of crimes that lead them here. But yes, certainly lots of convicts in the early days.
It's very popular these days doing family history, isn't it? And a lot of people publish their own researched of their own family history. But it's not every family's history is going to be readable, is it? What was your process of thinking, well, I don't want this just to be an account of my family's history. I want it to be a book that can be published and bought and read. Yeah,
well, it needs to be big, is the first thing. It needs to be slightly cheeky. I mean, you've got to remember at that time, I was a nobody in Australian history. I had a PhD in medieval European history, was starting to make a bit of a career and a name for myself in that area. And I'd published a few works of Australian history. But beside that, I was a nobody. So it was the strength of academic credentialing, the cheekiness of someone my age writing a book of that sort, and tapping into that Mishnah tradition of a big book that shows long-term things over time, with a little bit of a revisionist thread running through it constantly, just checking, are these stories we've inherited true? And I think that mix of things is what I was set out to do from the beginning, and really stuck with it basically throughout the whole process.
Do you animate your family characters, your ancestors? Do you put words into their mouth? Or?
No, but what I was really fascinated with trying to do, wherever possible, is to take their words and put them on the page. And so because of that, like that newspaper phenomenon where we can get digitised records, I could find a remarkable amount of interviews. You know, even with some, like there's a William Duck, who's my great-great-grandfather, I think, or maybe another great, I can't remember now, but he's just a farmer in Camden. You know, he arrives and doesn't do much and doesn't leave much of a documentary record, but he is interviewed. And so he tells his own story in his own words to the newspaperman. And so all I have to do in the book really is to trim that, take the newspaperman out a bit, and I've got his words there.
How long ago was the interview?
That would have been early 20th century, I think. I can't remember now, but it's certainly early 20th century. The local newspaper records his voice, and I found that really interesting, especially when you look at the family over long periods of time and the different personalities that emerge. Some of them are very well documented. One of them is William Marcus Dilmackey, who's a bit of a tyrant, really, a bit of a Trump-esque figure. He's probably the most famous and prominent of my family.
Who is he again?
He's a Presbyterian minister who travels the country stirring up trouble, basically. Very anti-Catholic, very engaged with the Orangeman movement, and a bit of a man out of time. You know, he's aggressively pushing this, the Pope's going to take over the world line at about the time that World War I's about to take place. So he's a fascinating character in that regard, and I have a wealth of material about him. You know, his voice is everywhere. And so the real narrative trick for me was actually balancing out the fact that I had so much from him and so little from others to try and create it.
Because he's the sort of the celebrity ancestor.
Yeah, who would dominate my telling of the family history if I let him, so corralling him. But also through that, you can get the sense that, well, he dominated his family. He dominated the next generation or two are pretty quiet. You know, they're much more muted individuals, and I suspect that's in part a reaction to him.
And as for the Camden farmer who led a quiet life, all right, you've got his words, but what's he saying? I mean, is he talking about the price of sheep, or what's he saying that's of interest?
He's talking about a storm taking away earth in the land and the difficulties of working the land. And again, that even though it's so small, really captures into the essence of his story. You know, here's somebody who's just struggled to make good and leave the best they can to the next generation, which is really the story of that wave. He's not one of the first waves of immigrants. He's one of the subsequent ones, the masses who come in from Europe in the 19th and early 20th century, just trying to make good. And so those words, even though they're small, I think really do capture the essence of that story.
I'm not sure if it's your exact next book, but I think the Vandemonian War came after Kin.
Yep.
And here you turn your attention to Tasmanian history, specifically the British military campaign, as you call it, against the Indigenous people. So just broadly, are you the descendant of settlers or invaders?
Both, but not from Tasmania. So there's a small Tasmanian moment in Kin as a couple of my ancestors get off the boat for a couple of days before they get on the boat and go to New South Wales. So my ancestry does not link directly to Tasmania. Although while I was writing it, I was very conscious of some Brodies and made a point of writing them into the book so that I'm acknowledging that I'm part of that whole tradition, even if not explicitly in these cases. But they're not mutually opposing terms. Invader and settler are exactly the same thing. And if you think about the wider history of the world and the history of the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire, the Spanish Empire, they're both. The first wave in particular are very invaderish, but they're almost always aiming to settle, and then the subsequent waves that are coming through are part of that, until the process is finished.
You said earlier that you are something of a revisionist historian, and your book, the publishers blurb it as, this is a destroyer of myths, and your thesis is that the British did actually mount a military campaign against the Indigenous people, but hasn't that always been what's the understanding of what happened, that there was a...
Not fully. What's really been the story in Tasmania has been that it's largely been out of the government's control. That's the important thing. The government wanted to do the best it could, but didn't really manage to stop the atrocities happening. And that's largely because the people who'd written that version, and there's multiple generations of them, even though they take slightly different political takes on it, hadn't really engaged with the government's own evidence. They mostly dealt with the stories that had come from early histories, the stories that had come from the settlers writing into the government, but they'd never really looked for where the government's directives were. And that's the bit that I found, and that was really the game changer. First, because it gave us the government's perspective in their own words, written to their commanders at the front, but also because it knitted it all together, rather than just having these disparate reports coming in from various areas of Tasmania. You could see how the government was connecting them all and thinking about it all and reacting to the situation. So there's always been a sense that the military are involved, but the sense generally was that the military weren't very involved, and where they were sent in almost as peacekeepers. And now it's very clear that that's not the case. The military was sent in to get the Aboriginal people out of the area.
I suppose it might surprise some people when you say that these things haven't been looked at, government directives, because if we look back to the history wars of a decade or so ago, we've got Henry Reynolds on Lyndall Ryan on one side saying this was genocide, and Keith Windschuttle on the other side saying no, the amount of killing and so on has been exaggerated. Didn't they look at
they
this?
Did not look for it. It's incredibly hard to believe, but they did not look for it. They did not look for that particular record set, and I find it remarkable that neither they nor the generations before them, nor Keith Windschuttle, mind you, who went in to criticise them, really explored the full depth of the archive. Basically what you have is the same questions being asked of the same documents again and again and again. And what I did is I went in and really just thought about, well, we've got these records coming in, where are the corresponding records, where are the outgoing records? It's just a very simple process-based methodological question I asked myself in the archives, just as I would have for my PhD in European history. And so I set out to find them. And so I found the Colonial Secretary's correspondence to the police magistrates, which was a crucially important one. I found the Governor's order books, which had not been looked at. So there's this wealth of war-related documentation which has just never been looked at.
So is your book the last word on the subject?
No. No book will ever be the last word on the subject.
Well, you're going to run out of primary sources after a while, though.
Well, it's a long while to go. I can already think, I've got a couple of papers in process to follow that book up, really.
Or someone else might. But
I'm sure
sooner or
will,
later, it's all going to be looked at, isn't it?
Well, and that's when you start to then revise it. So once somebody's looked at something again and again, the point is to go back and check, are those previous interpretations correct? How can you reassess them? That's the doing of history. That's how history has gone on every generation. Think of something so overdone as Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And really only a few weeks ago there was a magnificent new discovery someone made where in Henry's own handwriting he orders the execution of Anne Boleyn by having her head cut off. It's a minor technical point in one of the order books, but that's 500 years of people writing about this story. And that had been missed.
But it's a tiny little detail, isn't it?
It is, but it's a really big one.
Is it enough to spark a whole new mini-series on Netflix?
It's probably not a book, but it'll certainly be an excellent article.
Well, but is it possible in the end to come to a definitive account of any particular episode or series of events in history?
Well, I think it's in this age of, we live in an age where truth and facts are constantly being contested, and we're talking about fake news and so on. But while it can be very difficult to come to a definitive view of a particular person, to capture their essence, their soul or so on, you can get the nuts and bolts right. On this day they did that. This letter was dated here and was received then. They wrote these words. They said this thing. So there are sorts of elements of factuality there which you can latch onto. And on the other side, there are elements of demonstrable untruths that you can show to be wrong. People can latch on to crazy conspiracy theories, but that's just them denying the evidence. The evidence is there, and it's quite easy to show that. So between those nuts and bolts, administrative almost, elements of history and the demonstrable untruths that are out there, you can latch onto a much firmer vision of history, I think, than was common in Australia maybe 20 or 30 years ago.
So you should aim for objectivity. Because there are some schools of thought, aren't there, that say there's no such thing. And if you think in this sort of postmodernist, post-structuralist way, that your view of history is going to be inevitably determined by your own racial and class background. You don't go along with that way of looking at it?
No, I'm quite happy to embrace the personal element. I embrace my own perspective often when I write. But there are parts of the process of researching and writing history that can't really influence. In the Vandemonian War, for instance, that's probably my least personal book, because I knew that this would be very contested and that people could make all sorts of accusations about my politics or whatever. And so I stepped back as a writer in a big way from that. And if you look at it very closely, really the introduction and the conclusion are the only parts where I really stepped to the fore as the author. The rest of it is stitching together the archive. I'm letting the words, the events speak for themselves, and readers can come to their own conclusions. And the conclusions are pretty inescapable. So I just let the evidence tell its own story.
The BBC are making, is it a series of documentaries or a documentary about?
No, so there's a series about the British Empire, of which Van Diemen's Land will be a part, and they've come to film me, so that'll be out.
They've come to film you?
Yeah.
So it's been done?
Well, my part's been done. Because of COVID, it's all disrupted. So I don't know when the release is, but it's coming. It's very cool.
And I believe Rachel Perkins, Indigenous filmmaker, she's doing something with
so SBS is going to be doing a series about frontier wars, and I've been engaged in the research and will be engaged in commenting on that as well.
It's interesting, isn't it, at a time when it's often observed that young folks know nothing about history these days, and yet in terms of popular culture, history is huge. There's your work, then there's all those British TV historians, Mary Beard, Bethany Hughes. Would you like to be one of them?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind being one of them. It's much more difficult work
Simon
than
Sharma,
it appears.
there are men, of course, yeah.
They make it look easy, and that's really the trick of that sort of stuff, to carry the sense that it's quite easy. There's a lot of very difficult writing goes on with producers and so on behind the scenes, and I've seen some of that. But yes, I'd love to be involved in that sort of TV popular history world.
Well, I'm a great fan of the historical documentary presented by the charismatic historian. And it always seems to me that they are doing their best to be objective and fair. But I know within the world of history, I read with surprise is acrimonious arguments and the jealousy and the envy and so on. Why is it like that?
There are all sorts of tensions because history is a funny discipline because it inhabits the academic world, but it also very much inhabits the popular world. You know, you've got people who do local history, people who do family history. They've got amateurs and professionals. You've got the heritage world. You know, it's everywhere basically. But there are all these fault lines. You know, there are some who believe themselves to be the professional caste. And often, you know, that'll be academics at elite institutions have that sort of view. Not always, but some do. Others just will have very pig-headed or outdated ways of doing history and thinking that are difficult to overcome and simply cause frustration. So there are all these lines of tension within the discipline without even introducing the actual politics of the moment, if you will, that often influences history. History is so easily turned to modern political purposes and always has been. The intense politicisation of German history by the Nazis, the stories of Gloriana by the British to justify empire, you name it. You know, every moment in history is looking back to history as a source of justification, in a way, for whatever's going on, and that will be contested in the same way. So you'll always have other people who have a different view.
Well, I'm thinking, for instance, of, I think it was Bettany Hughes who did the series on Captain Cook. I'm a great admirer of Cook because I like to think of him as a great navigator and scientist and in his own way a great humanitarian. And yet, yes, we have the great argument over the statue there in Hyde Park in Sydney. What do you think? What's your take on what do we do with historical statues that don't quite mean what they did when they were erected?
It depends on the statue, is really the question, I think. And the questions behind the scenes are, when was it erected, for what purpose was it erected, and by whom? And then, how is it being understood and interpreted now? And in some extreme examples, yes, there might be a good argument to be made for removing a statue from public. And I'm not necessarily talking about smashing it to bits in the public square. You know, just if this is causing great offence to a considerable number of people over a long period of time, then okay, that needs to be revised. And that's a perfectly acceptable discussion for the public square generally, I think, regardless of whether it's a historic statue or something, you know, some cement monstrosity, as my brother calls them, put in a week ago. So everybody has their own opinions, and that's all fair. But when it comes to the actual histories, things like the Cook statue, the offensive part isn't really the statue of Cook. It's the fact that it says he discovered Australia. You know, that's the bit that gets people. And there have been suggestions that all it would require is a plaque saying that's not true, you know, and that would mollify the sense that this is. And it's that rejection, it's that sense that, no, the statue as it was erected in 1879 captures the true history and needs to be the true history forever after. I think that's the problem people take with it. And that's why you see the frustrations boil over. Australia's a funny one because it's tied up so much with the colonial narrative, which is so strong in our national history. But when you look at those other countries where statues are so heavily contested, I'm thinking of the US and the Confederate statues, they're not, you know, the statues of Lee, General Lee, are not raised in his lifetime or immediately thereafter. They're raised much later in the Jim Crow era and racist, segregationist Southern American ideology. So they're erected with a very clear, very dark purpose, really. And so they're horrid. I think that fair enough, get rid of them. The statue of Colston in Bristol is the other example. This is
the one that was actually torn down and thrown into a river.
Yeah, he's the one who. So he wasn't just somebody who happened to be a slave owner, as almost every landowner in England was at a certain period. He was the head of the company. You know, he was deeply involved in the slave trade, and so there had been a long process of contesting that statue. You know, should it be taken down? Should there be something put up to interpret it? You know, just this raw glorification of the man was the problem, and it was going that way for, you know, there's like a 15-20 year discussion before, but basically because of the Black Lives Matter protests, tensions boiled over and that statue came down. But You know, there was reasoned attempts to resolve the situation for a long time before the statue came down.
Although, that's an open and shut case, I suppose. What about something a little bit more ambiguous, like, Cecil Rhodes at Oxford? I mean, he, on the one hand, yes, great colonialist. Some people have said recently that actually in Zimbabwe they would have been better off being run by the heirs of Rhodes. But no, they say no. I think they did take his statue down, didn't they? Well, and also, if you say we've got to take the statue down at Oxford, do you give back the money, the foundation that built Oxford University?
Well, that's Oxford University predates Rhodes by a considerable period, so that's one thing. I think the university itself is safe without Rhodes. Rhodes is a terrible dude, really. When you look at it in hindsight, he was quite the shocker. And he's a bit like Colston, the philanthropic turn late in life to donate things in his memory is in a way an attempt to perhaps salvage his own memory, perhaps a realisation that he was a shocker. So in that sense, you can keep the money provided you acknowledge that history. It's still put to a good use. The Rhodes Scholarships serve a useful purpose, though I never got one. I didn't even know, as a kid in junior, you never knew to apply for these things. But that broader sense of putting up a statue to Cecil Rhodes and glorifying him uncritically, that's again the problem. So I think it's just as simple as engaging with the wider process and make sure that everybody's on the same page, that this is a nuanced history. This is not a clear-cut black and white issue. This is always nuanced. Well,
let's come back to Australia now. Now, the book about Kosciuszko, but let's say Kosciuszko, because that's what everyone says in Australia. Now, tell us, there's a history which you've told through an episode involving the disappearance of two athletes, one American, I believe.
Yep.
This happened in 1928.
Yep.
Now, how did you come across this story?
Really, I was looking for another history to write, and as I thought about the topics that were interesting me, I gradually settled on the idea of writing a history of Kosciuszko, the mountain, because it seemed iconic to Australia and hadn't really been done in that big sense. And originally I was thinking, again, in that missioner sense, a big place over a long period of time. And as I was slowly starting to gather materials and think about how I might construct this, I just kept finding this story, it kept getting referred to. And so that's what drew me into their story, and I began to think of it as a different sort of book. I thought it's time to maybe have a go at something different myself and use an adventure story in a way that tells a bigger story too. Probably tapping in more to that American journalistic writing tradition, John Krakauer and so on, the author of The Perfect Storm and Into Thin Air. Those stories of small, in hindsight they might seem small, but at the time they loom large. These big media event stories that tell us something about the societies that witness them.
It's a story I'd never heard about before, and I presume you could say that it's been forgotten, but was it a big sensation at the time? What actually happened?
It was huge. So basically there's this American lorry seaman who's pretty well-to-do, and an Australian, Evan Hayes, who grew up in he was born in Parramatta but grew up in Cooma and Parramatta and so on. And they were skiing. They were part of that early phase of Australian sporting engagement with the mountains, the early days of organised ski trips and the Kosciuszko Hotel and this whole world of Australia moving in a leisurely way, touristic way into the mountains. And so they're at that sort of very early wave, and they go missing, basically. They go off to ski towards the mountain and a blizzard comes through, and after the blizzard their mates notice that they're no longer there. And so it's the story of their disappearing, going to the mountain anyway, so that's that whole cultural history of that. The episode of them going skiing and going missing, and then the huge search operations that come in to go and seek them out. And through all of that, you can pull together this cast of interesting characters from Australia in the 1920s, which I often think of as a bit of an overlooked period. Our histories are so often the first wave colonisation, the foundation of Sydney and the blah-de-blah, or the foundation of Melbourne, and within 30 years the histories peter out.
And gold rushes.
Yeah, and so, but after Eureka until the First World War is a bit of a quiet period in terms of popular historical writing. And I wanted to look at one of those sorts of periods, and that interwar period I thought seemed to fit that.
What made it such a notable story, though? I mean, people do go missing on mountains and in the snow, but I presume, I remember the story of the fellow who was buried under the snow. I've even forgot his name now, but it's, I'm sure you know the one I mean. This is about 15 years ago, possibly longer. The fellow who survived after all those...
Stuart Diver, yeah.
Thank you. Was it a story of that magnitude at the time?
Yeah, well, it was in its own period. So a couple of forces collide to make it a big story. One is the ski fields are being developed. So there is intense, and it's hard to capture how intense the public interest is in Kosciuszko at this time. It's really becoming part of the nation's sense of self. So that's part of it. The other is that the newspapers and the wires are all connecting in such a way that a news story is possible. It's possible for a person to go missing in Kosciuszko, and for that story, because of the telegraph wires, to then become a story in Sydney, and it becomes a big story and quickly spreads around the world.
Around the world?
Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily become the leading story of the New York Times, but it does make it into the New York papers because Laurie Seaman is connected to Long Island. And New Zealand certainly picks it up, all the Australian colonies certainly pick it up. So in a way it's showing that early days of media fanfare, media fixation on these sorts of events. And why does this one become an object of interest? And it's really because it's the first major disappearance in Kosciuszko at this time where Kosciuszko is being developed, and the actual apparatus of media is there to create a story and also to document it and to survive, importantly, so that a historian can retell that.
Well, let's turn to your most recent book, Under Fire. It's a history of guns and gun control in Australia. Obviously, we can't canvass all that history at the moment, but can you just tell us, I know that you start out by saying that American early history and Australian early history were very similar in many ways, in that guns and violence played a large part in frontier development. Why then, if you can put it in a nutshell, has Australia not ended up plagued with the scourge of guns like America has?
Two things, because we have had basically... We've been good at dealing with it over the longer term. So there are crises. Basically, the history of gun control in Australia is the history of new gun technologies and new markets getting out there into the public, and then the state responding. And individual states do their own thing, the federal government does its own thing, but in general they all sort of try to do something each time that there's a problem. And America has that to a certain point, and then they stop. Basically, the gun rights movement takes over a libertarian extremism, and it becomes such an intense political wedge issue in America that it starts to fall apart. The other, I think, which is really crucial, is that America does have major gun manufacturers. So ultimately, Australia can resolve the issue in large part by stopping the import of many of these weapons, the worst of them in particular. And America, because it is a producer of those weapons, can't really do that unless they stop making them. So there's a major economic imperative in America which changes it as well.
I actually heard on radio just very recently that I think it's a fairly consistent figure too, that something like 70% of Americans would welcome much tighter gun control. So there's not actually the vast difference in attitudes, public attitudes, that is often supposed between the two countries.
Yeah, it's really it's because of wedge politics fundamentally. That you only have to get a certain proportion of the supporters who might go one way or another to make that their one dying issue, that it then becomes very intractable, and that's largely what's happened.
Tell us something about your own writing practices now, Nick. Your books sell well, at least I hope they do. They're getting on television. But you work at the archdiocese, the Catholic archdiocese, as an archivist, part-time.
So that's a part-time role, and the other days I write, basically.
Okay. So could you give up your day job if you wanted to?
Well, I didn't have the day job to start with, but I wouldn't want to. Basically because when you're a writer, the money comes in drips and draps. It's not regular. So having a little bit of regular coffee money is really good, especially because the first part of the daily writing process is to go and get a coffee. What I would normally do is I'd go have a coffee and have a bit of a read and a think, and then I'd just drift to the computer and sit there and tap, 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 tap away. Usually I'll get in the groove and it'll go, and somebody will tell me I have to stop and have lunch, and then I'll get back on it after lunch. And then I'll have a little slow period about 3 o'clock, have a bit of a play on the Xbox and go for a run or something.
A play on the Xbox?
Yep. Nothing like getting on a computer game.
And why does someone have to tell you to go and have lunch?
Because sometimes I get too absorbed and I can
that's enviable.
Work straight through, yeah.
What do you read yourself? Do you read fiction?
I do read fiction, but not very much anymore. I used to be a big fiction reader. You know, all those, I mean, a Michener novel is so big that it takes forever to read them. And I have read most of them, so Leon Uris, all those sorts of things. But these days I mostly would read history and or current affairs, non-fiction. That's sort of the spread of the books that tend to pass across my lap.
Do you need peace and quiet to read or to work, for that matter?
To read I do. I really struggle to read when there's too much noise around. Working, the experience of working in the software company broke my computer distraction element though. I can sit at the computer with a hell of a lot of noise around me and totally tune it out. It's a remarkable skill I've developed now.
A couple of the other young creatives I've met in this series say the same thing. They are able to work amidst noise, amidst the friendly bustle of a cafe. So do you work in cafes?
Yeah, often I will. I like getting up and being the first one in the door with my laptop and have an hour or two before the crowd starts to make it difficult to occupy a table.
So when you choose a subject to write about, how much are you influenced by what interests you, and how much by considerations of how many people are going to buy the book?
Saleability is very important to me. I find myself staring at bookshelves in the bookshops these days and thinking about what people are writing, what's coming out, what might be the next thing. That said, I'm not a sellout. I don't want to just write the Gallipoli book and the Kokoda book that's going to sell millions of copies. You know, for me, it has to be personally engaging. That's the first thing. But I'm trying to straddle that mix of engaging, methodologically rich historical research with accessible writing. And sometimes, you know, some of my books have been more successful than others. 1787, I think, really captured that in a way that, you know, maybe Kosciuszko didn't. But that is certainly in my mind.
Well, you'd think Kosciuszko would be more likely to lend itself to a Netflix series, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah, it could. I also thought it'll sell very well at Thredbo, you know. I did go to Thredbo and do the walk to Kosciuszko as part of that. But if you want to be a writer, it's very difficult to choose to expend most of your energy on the things that won't sell and won't make you money. But that said, I do a lot of other writing where I can divert my energies to things which might not have that reach. Is
there anything intrinsically selling out, though, about writing about Kokoda or Gallipoli or Breaker Morant?
No, well, I've written about Gallipoli as part of kin. Not Kokoda explicitly, but I did include Darwin in kin as well. And, you know, obviously with 1787, I'm really just tapping into the whole 1788 thing and playing off that. So there's nothing wrong with commercial writing as such, but when it's just slavishly repetitive, uncritical history, then I think that's intellectually bankrupt.
But if it sells well, then it presumably is what people want to read.
Not necessarily. I have this theory about this, because the reason I wrote so many books so quickly is because my brother, who's not a reader of the types of things that his wife is, when he goes to buy her a book for Christmas, he goes to the shelf and he looks for a set. He looks for somebody who's an author who has multiple books, and he buys them the most recent one of those. Once you've got a pile on the shelf, then you start to attract that sort of attention. So I think there's nothing really wrong with aggressively getting into people's faces in that way.
Well, Nick Brodie, it's been a great pleasure talking to you this morning. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for taking part in the Tamar Valley Writers' Fest.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
The Tamar Valley Writers' Festival podcast series is sponsored by Events Tasmania, M Visuals, and the award-winning Turner's Steelhouse Distillery at Grindelwald, home of Three Cuts Gin, the perfect accompaniment to a night of reading. For more information on any books mentioned in this program, please visit Petrarch's, Launceston's major bookshop and a wonderful supporter of the Tamar Valley Writers Festival.